The first drone reached him 40 seconds after he landed. That was fast. Cecil noted it in the margin of the report without looking up from his desk. The sensor array in Sector 7 had flagged the impact at 11:03 p.m. No aircraft, no parachute, no heat signature consistent with any known propulsion system. The crater was roughly the size of a compact car. The concrete around it cracked in a starburst pattern that suggested the object or person had come down hard and walked away from it without breaking stride. By 11:04, the scramble order was already moving through the GDA's night shift chain of command. Cecil set down his coffee. "Get me visual." The monitor wall blinked to the drone feed. A young man stood in the middle of the crater, hands in his pockets, looking up at the drone, with the mild interest of someone watching a ceiling fan. Spiky blonde hair slightly flattened on one side from the fall. White headphones hanging around his neck, the kind with small flame logos pressed into each cup. He wore a dark blue jacket over a yellow shirt, one button fastened at the collar, the rest open. His shoes were clean, somehow impossibly clean, given that he had just punched a hole in a GDA-monitored sidewalk from an altitude that the sensor array still hadn't finished calculating. "Do we have an ID?" "No, sir." "Run it again." Already running. Nothing in the database. No match to any registered enhanced individual domestic or international. No match to any Guardians affiliate, no known aliases. "Bring him in." The extraction team moved in under radio silence, which was standard. Cecil watched the feeds from 3 angles. The subject did not run. He did not fight the approach. He watched the team converge with the same mild attention he'd given the drone head, tilting slightly to one side as the vehicles cut off his exit routes. When they gestured him toward the transport, he went. Cecil watched him climb in without being touched, find the bench seat, and lean back like a man boarding a commuter train. That was the first thing that bothered Cecil. People who could leave craters and city sidewalks did not get into unmarked vans without a fight, unless they had already decided they wanted to be in the van. Petite. The containment wing was 3 levels below the main facility, accessible by 2 separate elevator shafts that could be independently flooded with suppression gas and reinforced with layered electromagnetic dampeners that GDA's engineering division had spent 18 months calibrating for use against enhanced subjects. The cell itself was a hexagonal room 12 feet across, walls of a nickel-iron composite that had stopped things significantly stronger than a human fist. The ceiling carried secondary EM emitters. The floor had pressure sensors calibrated to detect weight shifts that might precede an escape attempt. Cecil had built this room for Viltrumites. He watched the subject walk into it and sit down on the single bench, cross his arms, and look at the far wall. "Subject is contained," the duty officer reported over comms. "All locks engaged. Level 5 protocol active." Cecil pulled up the room's internal feed on a secondary monitor. "What's his vitals?" Elevated heart rate on entry, now dropping. Currently sitting at 62 beats per minute. Blood pressure reading normal. Body temperature. The officer paused. "Sir, the thermal sensors are giving inconsistent readings. We're recalibrating. Don't bother. Keep the locks on. Full observation. Nobody goes in. And if he tries to leave, he won't try. He'll do it." He watched the screen. The subject sat on the bench. He wasn't testing the walls. He wasn't pacing. He sat with the stillness of someone in a waiting room. Except his attention kept moving. Tracking the cameras, the emitters in the ceiling, the pressure plate outlines just visible beneath the synthetic floor coating. His eyes moved like someone reading a manual they'd already mostly memorized. After 4 minutes and 20 seconds, he spoke. The audio pickup caught it clearly. "So this is the demo version." Nobody was in the room with him. He said it to the air anyway, in the flat, slightly bored tone of a customer who had been handed a product and found it adequate, but not impressive. Cecil clicked the intercom open. "Can you hear me? You've had audio in here since I sat down." The subject still hadn't looked at the camera. The mic in the ceiling emitter on the northeast corner is the primary. The backup's built into the bench. He finally looked up directly at the primary camera. His expression was relaxed, carrying the particular quality of someone who had done the math and found it simple. "I didn't walk in because you caught me. I walked in because I wanted to see what you'd built." Cecil did not answer immediately. He had learned over the course of a long career that silence was information. What people did with silence told him more than what they said. The subject waited him out without any sign of discomfort. "What's your name?" "Izayoi Sakamaki." "Where are you from?" "Somewhere you don't have on any map." Not the self-importance people usually gave that kind of line, just a fact delivered like one. You're already figuring that out. The database check is still running. It won't find anything. Cecil switched to a different camera angle. From the side, the subject Izayoi looked younger than Cecil had initially clocked, mid-teens maybe, the kind of age that made the situation considerably more complicated if it ever ended up in a courtroom. Cecil noted that, filed it, and moved on. "You seem comfortable. The room's good, better than most." Izayoi glanced at the wall to his left, then at the floor. EM dampeners pressure triggers gas suppression in the ventilation. I'm guessing the shafts flood from the top, not the bottom, so subjects don't have time to hold their breath. Composite walls, probably nickel iron. The lock system is layered probably 4 or 5 fail-safes with at least one analog backup, so I can't just cut the power grid. He paused. "You built this for something stronger than a human." Cecil said nothing. Good design. Genuinely. Somebody put thought into it. He stood up from the bench, stretched once, arms above his head, a slow roll of his neck that the cameras picked up clearly, and walked to the wall. He pressed 2 fingers against the composite surface, at a point roughly 18 inches from the floor in the seam between 2 panels. A sound moved through the room. Not an explosion. Something quieter. A soft, mechanical sigh, like a lock giving up a secret it had been holding for years. One of the ceiling emitters went dark. On Cecil's monitor, a green indicator on the lock schematic shifted to amber. One layer of the fail-safe system had just been removed. Izayoi stepped back and looked at his fingers like he was checking for dust. "How many layers is that?" "4. You have 3 left." He looked at the camera again. "I can finish in about 30 seconds, or I can not finish." On the schematic, the amber indicator held. The other 4 locks stayed green. The rest of the room systems continued reading normal. Izayoi had peeled one piece of the structure apart with 2 fingers and a sound. Cecil's engineering team would spend the next week trying to categorize, and then he had stopped. Why stop? Because walking out isn't the interesting part. Izayoi went back to the bench and sat down. He pulled his headphones up from around his neck, held them in both hands but didn't put them on, running a thumb along the flame logo on the right cup. "I want to see what you do next. Whether you try to negotiate, or whether you try something with the remaining 3 locks that you think I haven't accounted for, or whether you do something actually creative." He looked up at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a challenge, but occupied the space between them. "I've been bored for a very long time. This is the most interesting room I've been in recently. Don't ruin it by panicking." Cecil unmuted his direct line to the duty officer. "Rotate the overnight team. Bring in the Sigma unit and have them on standby 2 corridors out." "Yes, sir." And get me a line to Grayson." The duty officer hesitated. "It's past 11, sir." "I know what time it is." Noon. The Sigma unit made contact with the cell block at 11:47 p.m. 6 operatives, each carrying suppression equipment calibrated for enhanced class subjects, moving in 2 staggered columns with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times and understood the cost of doing it wrong. They stopped outside the cell door and waited for the green light. Cecil gave it. The door opened. 3 of the 6 moved in. Inside, Izayoi had not moved from the bench. He watched them enter with the same evaluating stillness he'd given the room itself. The lead operative began a verbal command standard protocol. "Identify yourself, hands visible, do not resist," and made it 3 words in. What happened next was quick enough that the camera feed had to be slowed to half speed for the incident report. Izayoi came off the bench without apparent effort and moved through the formation in a single, unbroken line of motion that left all 3 operatives on the floor in the time it took the door to finish its automated close cycle. He hadn't used the walls. He hadn't used the floor as leverage. He had moved through the middle of them like water finding the lowest point, and the only sounds were 3 short impacts that the audio pickup registered as less violent than they looked on playback. None of them were unconscious. None of them had broken bones. They were simply stopped in the way that a very large, very patient hand might stop something by not getting out of the way. Izayoi stood in the center of the room, hands back in his pockets, and looked at the primary camera. 3 locks left. And now you know I can go through your people without leaving marks. You're going to recalculate. He waited a beat. Good. Do that. I'll wait. Cecil watched the 3 operatives carefully extract themselves from the floor. His face behind the monitor wall was its usual arrangement, flat attentive, revealing nothing. He had seen things in this building that would have unmade most people. He had learned to process them as data. He processed this as data. One condition. While you're deciding whether to walk out, and I understand you've decided you can, you don't use civilians? Anyone not in this building, not on my payroll, off limits. Are we clear? Izayoi's head tilted a fraction. Why would that be your first condition? Because it's the one that matters to me. A pause. Not long. Izayoi's expression shifted into something harder to read, still not hostile. Still carrying that baseline quality of detached amusement, but with something underneath it now that was paying closer attention. All right. I don't touch civilians. You have 24 hours before I decide whether this game is worth continuing. He looked away from the lens toward the far wall like something else had caught his interest. The next move is yours. Try to make it interesting. Cecil closed the intercom. He switched to a view of the whole schematic, 1 lockout, 3 remaining 5 operatives standing in a corridor waiting for instructions. A teenager sitting in a room designed to hold a Viltrumite and apparently finding it mildly engaging. He reached for his phone. Mark Grayson answered on the 3rd ring, voice rough with interrupted sleep. I need you downtown by morning. We have a situation that isn't going to wait. There was a pause on the line. In the containment room, Izayoi had closed his eyes. He looked on the monitor completely at ease. Like someone who had found, after a long and tedious search, a place worth sitting still in. What kind of situation? Cecil looked at the screen. The kind that I don't have a file on yet. The footage was gone by 6 a.m. Not deleted, deletion left traces. Cecil's people had done something more thorough. They had replaced it. 42 seconds of city surveillance covering the impact site on Renner Avenue had been swapped out for 42 seconds of the same street, same angle. Empty, sourced from 3 weeks prior when the weather had been similar enough to pass a casual review. The crater itself was behind temporary construction fencing before the first commuter bus ran its morning route. and the 3 civilians who had been close enough to film anything on their phones had each received a visit before sunrise. 2 had signed ND, as without much pushback. The third had required a more detailed conversation involving his employer, his security clearance, and what would happen to both if he posted the video he'd taken. Cecil reviewed the overnight report at his desk while the city woke up around a hole in the ground it wasn't allowed to know about. "Renner Avenue is holding," his deputy told him from the doorway. "Construction story is running on the local traffic apps. We've got 2 reporters asking questions, one from the Tribune, one freelance. Freelance has a source inside the fire department." Pull the source? Already flagged. "We're also getting pressure from the mayor's office. They want a briefing." "Give them the construction story." "They know it's not construction." "Then give them a better version of the construction story." Cecil turned a page. One that lets them say they were informed without knowing anything useful. They'll take it. They always do. The deputy left. Cecil finished his coffee, read to the bottom of the incident log, and circled one line in red. Subject exited containment at 4:17 a.m. Perimeter sensors tracked movement northeast. Signal lost at 4:31 a.m. 14 minutes. Then nothing. Whatever Izayoi Sakamaki had decided to do with his morning GDA's surveillance grid hadn't been invited. Mark found the construction fencing at 7:40 a.m. still in his civvies. Dark green jacket jeans, the worn sneakers he kept by the door for exactly this kind of early call. He crouched at the edge of the fencing and looked at the crater through the gap between 2 panels. It was deeper than it looked in the photos Cecil had forwarded. The starburst fractures in the concrete ran almost to the curb on both sides. Whatever had come down here had done it at speed. And the thing that bothered Mark wasn't the crater itself. He'd seen worse. It was the footprints leading out of it. Clean, even-spaced, heading north. Not the stumble pattern of someone who had just survived a fall. A walking pace. Unhurried. His earpiece clicked. "You're at the site. You're watching me. I'm always watching something. Don't spend too long there. We have eyes on a heat signature 2 miles northeast that matches our subject's last known position. He's in the commercial district." Doing what? Walking around, looking at things. A pause that managed to carry a specific weight of impatience. "I need you to make contact before he gets bored and decides to make the morning interesting. Keep him talking. Keep him away from anything with structural load-bearing value." Mark straightened up. "And if he doesn't want to talk, then you improvise. That's what you do." The line clicked off. Mark looked at the footprints one more time, then pushed off the fencing and went northeast. He picked up the trail by the damage, which was subtle enough that most people moving past hadn't clocked it. A traffic light on the corner of Renner and 5th was running a cycle that didn't match its neighbor's green for 12 seconds longer than the pattern, which meant something had touched the control box and rearranged its priorities. 3 blocks further, a security camera above a pharmacy entrance was aimed 4 degrees further left than its mounting bracket should have allowed, now covering a blind spot it had previously missed. Mark slowed at that one. The camera's indicator light was steady green. It was still recording. Whatever had adjusted it hadn't broken, it just redirected it. He found Isayoi 2 blocks later, standing in front of a newsstand, not reading a paper, studying the rack of headlines with the detached focus of someone who had found the display genuinely interesting, but not in the way the headlines intended. He had his headphones on now, the white ones with the flame logos resting over his ears, though Mark couldn't hear any sound coming from them. He was still in the same clothes from the containment footage, dark blue jacket, 1-button yellow undershirt. He looked like a teenager on a school trip who had wandered off and found something more entertaining than the itinerary. Mark stopped a few feet away. You adjusted that camera back there. Izayoi didn't turn around. It had a blind spot. That's not why you moved it. No. He pulled one side of the headphones down to his neck. But the blind spot was there. So now it isn't. He finally turned, looking Mark over with a quick assessing sweep that felt less like sizing up an opponent and more like reading a form. Invincible. Cecil sent you. Cecil suggested I come. There's a difference. Something in Izayoi's expression shifted slightly. Not a smile exactly, but an acknowledgement the way a person might nod when a stranger says something less obvious than expected. He told you to keep me talking. He told me to make contact. Same thing. He wants you between me and anything expensive. Izayoi glanced back at the newsstand. One of the front pages had a stock photo of a downtown intersection under the headline, Infrastructure Concerns. City Council to review road safety. The Renner Avenue story already repackaged. Fast. Whoever runs your media ops is good. It's not my media ops. You're wearing his leash, though. Not aggressive observational, the same tone he'd used for the camera in the blind spot. He looked at Mark again, steady. How many things does he cover up a year? Real number, not the number he tells you. Mark held the eye contact. I don't always know what I don't know. That's kind of the point. And that doesn't bother you. It bothers me plenty. Mark kept his voice even. But the alternative isn't simple either. If everything went public, there'd be panic, there'd be people who'd try to exploit it, I didn't ask for the argument. I asked if it bothers you. Izayoi's voice hadn't changed. Still level, carrying the register of someone working through a problem rather than winning one. It does. So you already know the thing you're defending has a crack in it. You just haven't decided what to do about the crack yet. Mark didn't answer immediately. Down the block, a woman had stopped to take a photo of the construction fencing on Renner and a man in a gray jacket. Not a GDA uniform. Nothing so obvious had materialized near her and begun a conversation that would end with her putting her phone away and walking on. Mark watched it happen and felt the specific familiar discomfort of recognizing something he didn't like and not having a clean answer for it. If you want to talk to me. Don't make other people pay for whatever issue you have with how this city runs. Izayoi watched the gray-jacketed man escort the woman's attention away from the fencing. Already I'm talking to you. He pulled the headphones back up. Walk with me. I want to see something. He led Mark 7 blocks east to a stretch of commercial real estate that had been half vacant for 2 years, closed storefronts, a diner still running a community health clinic with a line out the door at 8 in the morning. Izayoi stopped across the street from the clinic and watched it with a stillness that didn't fit the context. What are you looking at? Capacity. There were maybe 30 people in the line. Half of them were standing, a few sitting on the curb. One older man in a wheelchair positioned under the narrow strip of awning that wasn't letting in much of the morning cold. If something large happened in this neighborhood, how long before this place stopped being able to handle it? That's a strange question. It's a planning question. Izayoi's gaze moved to the street itself, the width of the sidewalks, the spacing of the buildings, the single access road that fed into the block from the north. Your city plans for some emergencies, and not others. The ones it doesn't plan for are usually the ones involving people like me. He glanced at Mark. Or people like you. Mark looked at the clinic, then back at him. Is that a threat? It's an observation. I've been in cities like this before. Different rules, same structural problem. The people with the least margin are always closest to the things that go wrong. He wasn't performing concern. His tone carried the flat quality of someone reporting a measurement. I'm not here to blow up a clinic. I'm here because this is what the game looks like from ground level. Most people who show up in places like this, a slight gesture toward the general skyline, the invisible infrastructure of the GDA and its surveillance grid and its construction fencing, never look at ground level. A beat of silence. Somewhere behind them, a siren started and faded ambulance heading east routine. Cecil told you to keep me busy. He also told you not to let me near anything structural, which means he's moving something he doesn't want me near. Probably from the secondary facility, the one with the data archive, not the one with the people. He looked at Mark with that same unhurried measuring regard. If I were you, I'd want to know what he's moving. Mark kept his expression controlled. The problem was that Izayoi was right, and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been the kind of obvious play that would close off the conversation entirely. Why tell me? Because you're the one who'd actually care. He turned away from the clinic, heading back the way they'd come. The rest of them would file a report. They were 2 blocks from the newsstand when the GDA contact team caught up 4 plainclothes operatives in 2 vehicles converging from separate directions with the practiced timing of a coordinated approach. Mark saw them coming. So did Izayoi, a full 30 seconds before they got close enough for the approach to make sense. Mark watched him clock all 4 simultaneously without appearing to look at any of them directly. Your people. Cecil's people. The first vehicle cut across the intersection ahead. Izayoi stopped walking. He didn't tense, didn't shift his weight into anything that looked like preparation. He simply stood on the sidewalk and watched the 4 operatives establish their positions, with the even untroubled interest of someone observing a choreographed exercise they hadn't been asked to participate in. The lead operative said something into his collar. The overhead camera on the corner building swiveled toward them. Standard protocol document, the contact point. The indicator light on the camera housing blinked twice, then went dark. On the building across the street, a second camera did the same. Mark heard very faintly the sound he associated with electronics, making a decision they hadn't been programmed to make. 14 seconds. Then both cameras came back online, indicators steady, the way a person might reopen their eyes after a moment of thought. Izayoi had not moved his hands. The lead operative looked up at the cameras with the expression of someone whose equipment had just done something the manual didn't cover. He took a half step back. You can tell them to stand down. Or they can try the approach and we'll all learn something about how much Cecil budgets for vehicle bodywork. Mark touched his earpiece. Cecil, pull them back. A long pause. In Cecil's pauses, Mark had learned there was always calculation, the weight of options, the math of acceptable outcomes. Pull back to 50 meters, maintain visual. The 4 operatives retreated without making it look like a retreat. The vehicles repositioned. The cameras stayed on. Izayoi watched them go, with the same expression he'd given the headlines, at the newsstand, interested but not surprised. He looked at Mark. He pulled back to 50 meters. Yeah, he's still watching. Obviously. Good. Izayoi started walking again, heading north away from the construction fencing and the covered crater and the replaced footage and the managed civilian with her phone. One thing before I go. Tell Cecil nobody pulls civilians into this. Not as bait, not as leverage, not as collateral for a containment op. That's the line I'm drawing. If he crosses it, I stop being interesting and start being a problem. He paused at the corner, not looking back. Tell him I know what he moved this morning. And tell him the 48-hour clock starts when I decide it does not when he does. He rounded the corner. By the time Mark reached the intersection, the signal from Izayoi's last known position had already dropped off the GDA grid. Not jammed, not blocked. Just gone the way a door closes when someone on the other side has decided the visit is over. Mark stood at the corner for a moment. Down the block, the community health clinic was still running its morning line. The man in the wheelchair had gotten inside. The woman who'd been stopped near the construction fencing was at a bus stop, now the phone in her pocket, buying a coffee from a cart. The city moved around all of it, unbothered, unaware of the 14-second gap in the surveillance record or the cargo that had been quietly transferred out of a GDA secondary facility before dawn. His earpiece clicked. Report! He knows about the transfer, and he drew a line. No civilians used as bait leverage or collateral. His words? Silence. Then, how much does he know about the transfer? Enough to tell you he knows. Which means he's choosing to tell you rather than act on it. That's the part I'd think about. Another pause. Cecil's pauses had different textures. This one was the kind that meant he was already 3 moves past the conversation. Come in. I need you for a briefing. Give me 10 minutes. Mark looked north where Izayoi had gone. The intersection was ordinary. A delivery truck, 2 cyclists, a woman walking a dog that was trying very hard to investigate a lamppost. Nothing out of place. Nothing to indicate that somewhere in the normal operation of the city, a variable was moving through it at its own pace. Reading the architecture, taking notes on what the game looked like from the ground. High above the city's eastern edge, beyond where the drone grid reached and the satellite coverage thinned, something else was watching too. Not with cameras, not with interest in cover stories or data transfers or the capacity of a neighborhood clinic. The signal had been brief, a narrow-band scan, the kind used for preliminary planetary assessment. It had lasted 4 seconds and then gone silent. In the GDA's Deep Space Monitoring Station, a junior analyst flagged it as instrument noise and moved on. She was wrong, but she wouldn't know that for another 36 hours. The secondary facility went dark at 2:14 a.m. Not all of it. One wing, specifically the administrative corridor connecting the data archive to the northeast stairwell. The darkness lasted 11 seconds. When the backup generators kicked the lights back on, 3 locked doors in that corridor were standing open, their electronic deadbolts not broken, but simply disengaged the way a fist unclenches when the hand decides it has been holding something long enough. The security detail on that floor reported no movement, no audio, no pressure triggers. The motion sensors had registered nothing. In the monitoring center, 2 levels up, a duty officer stared at the log timestamps and tried to find the sequence that explained what had happened. There wasn't one. The doors had opened. Nothing had come through them as far as any instrument could determine. But the archive room at the end of the corridor was missing 43 files. Not deleted, not copied, but gone from the index entirely, as if the system had decided they had never been cataloged in the first place. The duty officer picked up the phone. Cecil answered before the second ring. Which files? Not a question. The officer read the index numbers. A pause on the line, short and dense. Initiate Protocol 7. Start with the Eastern Annex. Move the Haverson assets first, then the medical documentation. You have 90 minutes before I need confirmation. Sir, should we? 90 minutes? The call ended. Across 6 different GDA facilities within a 40-mile radius. Protocol 7 began its cascade. Encrypted drives, physically removed from server racks, transferred to couriers who did not know what they were carrying. 24 individuals moved from one holding location to another in vehicles with no electronic manifests. A set of research records that had never officially existed, beginning the process of becoming even less official. It was not panic. It was the practiced efficiency of an organization that had spent years building contingency into its architecture because Cecil had always known in the back of his calculations that one day something would come along that their locks were not designed to stop. He had just not expected it to come from wherever this kid had come from. Mark got the call at 2:40 a.m. Cecil's voice was the same temperature it always was, which meant nothing good. "I need you at Facility 4, East Entrance. Don't fly drive. I don't want you visible on approach." "What happened?" "Come see." The drive took 20 minutes. Mark parked 2 blocks out as instructed and went the rest of the way, on foot badge, out through a security cordon that had been assembled with the grim efficiency of people who had been woken up and given a task they didn't fully understand. Inside the Eastern Annex, the lights were on, full, overcompensating for the earlier darkness, the way people turn up every light in a house after hearing something they can't explain. Cecil was in the archive corridor. He was looking at the 3 open doors with the expression he used when the math had produced a result he hadn't wanted but recognized as correct. "Walk me through it." Without turning around. "You called me." "I know why I called you." He finally turned. He was here. Came through the main entrance, front camera caught him clear as daylight, walking in like he had a badge. 14 people in the building. Not one of them saw him in person. Not one door was forced. 43 archive files are gone from the index. The physical drives are still in the racks. He paused. He didn't take anything. He erased the record of it. Mark looked at the open doors, then at the empty corridor beyond. Why those specific files? Because those specific files are the ones that would cost me most if they went public. Cecil's voice carried no inflection of surprise, just the steady weight of someone recalibrating. He's not fishing. He knows exactly what this organization keeps and where it keeps it. Which means either he found a source, or he read something from the transfer we made yesterday morning that told him more than a file index should have. A short pause. Or he simply walked in and read the building. Down the corridor, one of the open rooms was a storage annex, shelving units, archive boxes, standard GDA administrative overhead. The second was a server room, drive still racked humming. The third door, the one at the end, was different. Mark moved toward it before Cecil said anything. The room was roughly the size of a large office. 6 cells along the right wall, each with a narrow observation window, each currently open. The cells were empty now. Whatever Protocol 7 had moved, it had moved from here too. But empty in the specific way that rooms are empty when they have recently held people. A folded blanket on the floor of the second cell. A cup with dried residue at the bottom of the third. A name scratched into the paint of the 4th cell wall low down near the floor where someone had found a way to leave something behind. Mark stood in the doorway and did not say anything for a moment. "Cecil." His voice came out level because he made it level. "What is this room operational holding?" Cecil had stayed in the corridor. "Enhanced individuals requiring assessment outside standard detention protocols." "How long?" That's not a simple qua. How long were people in these cells? A beat. The longest active case was 14 months. Mark looked at the name scratched near the floor. He didn't recognize it. He memorized it anyway. "You told me the secondary facilities were for equipment and research backup. I told you what you needed to know to do your job. That's not the same thing as..." "No, it isn't." He stepped into this doorway, looked at the room with the same flat, calibrating regard he gave every problem. "But consider the alternative. Individuals with powers we don't understand, no legal framework for classification, no reliable containment elsewhere. What would you have had us do?" Mark didn't answer. He had an answer, but it was the kind that required more than this corridor and this hour and this specific configuration of exhaustion and anger. He filed it and turned back to Cecil. "He opened these doors. He opened the archive corridor doors. These cells were already open when my team arrived. He triggered the whole wing, not just the records section. The individuals who were held here were released into the facility proper. We contained them before they reached the perimeter. A slight pause. Most of them. Most. 2 are unaccounted for. We're treating it as an internal matter. Mark looked at the scratched name again, then walked back out into the corridor. The building around them was running the particular kind of controlled urgency that Cecil's operations always produced: purposeful quiet, efficient, and deeply unwilling to explain itself. Izayoi had been in the eastern annex for approximately 4 minutes. He had come in through the front entrance because the front entrance was the most direct route, and because walking in through the front of a building that expected you to come through the back was, in his experience, the most reliable way to buy 30 uninterrupted seconds. The guard at the desk had looked at his face, then at the monitor beside him, then at his face again, and in the 3 seconds that took, the monitor had shown him an access credential that matched a name in GDA's rotating authorization file, because Izayoi had fed it one from the archive transfer data that Cecil had moved the previous morning. The credential would stop working in about 4 hours when someone in GDA's authorization department ran a routine audit. By then, it would not matter. He had moved through the facility in the order of priority he had established before entering archive: first cells, second infrastructure, third. The archive room had taken 90 seconds. He had not copied the files. He had no use for files. He had removed them from the index because an index Cecil could not verify was a management problem. And management problems cost time and attention that Cecil would otherwise spend on things Izayoi found less interesting. The cells had taken 45 seconds. The lock architecture on the holding wing was a simpler system than the archive designed for individuals, without technical countermeasures. And he had moved through it the way you move through a combination lock, when you have already worked out the numbers. He had not looked into the cells. He had opened them and walked out. In the outer corridor, a 6-person tactical unit had been waiting. Rapid response assembled fast, carrying suppression equipment that represented GDA's current best thinking about what worked on enhanced subjects. Izayoi had assessed the formation in approximately 2 seconds, identified the 3 structural vulnerabilities in their deployment, and resolved all 3 before the unit's lead operative had finished processing the fact that the door had opened. None of them were badly hurt. 2 had cracked ribs. 1 had a dislocated shoulder that would need to be set before morning. It had taken Izayoi 11 seconds, and when it was over, he had stepped over the unit's equipment suppression canisters, electromagnetic restraints, a device whose purpose he recognized as a frequency emitter, calibrated for pain induction, and continued toward the exit. He paused at the front desk on the way out. The guard from the entrance was no longer at his post, pulled back when the alert triggered following protocol. The monitor on the desk showed a GDA internal memo protocol 7 in effect. All non-essential personnel to secure positions. Below it, half visible in the document stack, a personnel transfer order. 14 names. The first 6 had check marks beside them already moved. The remaining 8 were still in transit. Izayoi read the document in the time it took to take 3 steps past the desk. He walked out of the front entrance at 2:31 a.m. The exterior cameras tracked him for 40 seconds, then lost him at the corner of the property's east fence where the coverage gap between 2 units was 11 feet wide. A gap that should have been flagged in the last security audit, but hadn't been because someone in the facilities division had been slow filing his report. The gap had been 11 feet wide for 6 months. Izayoi had found it in approximately the same amount of time it had taken him to read the personnel transfer order. Cecil's best trap went live at 3:45 a.m. in an industrial park 3 miles from the secondary facility. A cluster of warehouses that GDA had quietly acquired over the past 2 years for exactly this kind of contingency. The package was straightforward by Cecil's standards. A contained detonation array rated for a 12-meter blast radius, triggered remotely housed in a warehouse that contained nothing except the array itself, and a very convincing data signature suggesting it held something Izayoi would find worth investigating. The data signature had been planted in the facility's internal network before Protocol 7 began a breadcrumb, specific enough to look like a leak, vague enough to require physical confirmation. The detonation triggered at 3:47 a.m. 2 minutes after Cecil's monitoring team picked up a movement signal inside the warehouse perimeter. The blast was, by all technical measures, effective. The warehouse ceased to exist in any meaningful structural sense. The detonation array performed exactly as designed. The perimeter sensors registered a heat signature entering the structure at 3:46 a.m., and this was the part that took Cecil's team 4 minutes to accept. Registered it exiting the structure at 3:46 a.m., 53 seconds before the detonation sequence completed. The monitoring team reviewed the exit timestamp 3 times. It did not change. Cecil looked at the readout. Outside the warehouse was still settling metal framework, cooling debris field scattered across 40 meters of industrial tarmac, a column of smoke visible from the highway that would require another cover story before sunrise. An effective weapon, a precisely executed operation, and the target had stepped out of it 53 seconds early at a pace the exterior sensor logged as unhurried heading east toward the main road. Get me the exterior feed. The footage showed Izayoi walking away from the warehouse at 3:46 a.m. Hands in his pockets, the white headphones around his neck. He did not look back at the building. He crossed the industrial park access road, paused at the perimeter fence, and then between one frame and the next, in the single second the fence camera took to complete its rotation cycle, was gone. The duty officer beside Cecil said nothing. The monitoring team said nothing. Cecil clasped his hands on the desk in front of him and thought for a moment about what he had just spent in terms of resources and cover story and operational exposure to learn that a trap designed to kill a Viltrumite had been a minor scheduling inconvenience. Rebuild the cover story for the warehouse. Industrial accident. Gas line. Get the fire department there before the press. He stood. And pull the Halverson documentation out of transit. I want it back in my facility, not scattered across 6 couriers. Sir, Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was designed for threats that respond to Protocol 7. Cecil picked up his coat. Get me Grayson, and get me whatever we have on the scan anomaly from 36 hours ago. The one the analyst flagged as noise. Mark was in the parking structure outside Facility 4 when his earpiece clicked back on. The warehouse in the Callahan Industrial Park. Drive past it on your way in. Mark had already seen the smoke from 2 miles out. He drove past the access road without slowing. The fire department was already there. Orange cones channeling civilian traffic away, a perfectly ordinary gas explosion on a night when the city's emergency services were already stretched thin from 2 other incidents that had nothing to do with GDA. He thought about the name scratched into the paint near the floor of the 4th cell. He thought about 14 months. He pulled into the GDA facility and sat in the car for a moment before going in. Through the windshield, the smoke from the warehouse was a dark column against the pre-dawn sky. And it occurred to him in the specific way that things occur to you at 4 in the morning when you have been awake too long, that Cecil had just blown up a warehouse to try to kill a teenager, and the teenager had walked away from it, and the city around all of it was asleep and unaware, and somewhere in that city, 2 people whose names were in a GDA holding record were unaccounted for. He went inside. Stunned, in the deep space monitoring station on the facility's upper level, the analyst who had flagged the scan anomaly as instrument noise 36 hours ago was running the signal through a second filter. because her supervisor had asked her to, because Cecil had asked her supervisor, because the pattern was not consistent with instrument noise after all. The signal had characteristics associated with Viltrumite long-range planetary assessment, a scan type that GDA's database had last flagged 18 months ago, when Omni-Man had still been a reliable asset and the Viltrumite Empire had been a theoretical problem rather than a practical one. It had lasted 4 seconds. It had been pointed at the North American continent, specifically at a corridor of urban density corresponding to the greater metro city area. The analyst wrote up her finding and sent it up the chain. Cecil read it at 4:22 a.m., while the warehouse cover story was still being assembled and the Halverson documentation was still in transit, and Mark Grayson was somewhere in the building, not yet ready to have the conversation they were going to need to have. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. Something had been watching. And whatever it had seen, the anomaly, the disruption, the gap in GDA's control grid, or simply the presence of a variable that did not resolve cleanly against anything in their planetary threat models, had apparently been worth a second look. He picked up the report and wrote one word in the margin: confirmed. The first one came down like a dropped hammer. No warning, no approach vector. The radar net could track just a streak across the afternoon sky above Metro City's financial district, trailing a compression wave that blew out the windows of 3 towers simultaneously before the thing hit the plaza at the intersection of Keller and 4th. The impact registered on seismic sensors as a 2.1. The crater in the marble plaza was 4 feet deep. The fountain at the center of the intersection no longer existed. He stood up from it without dusting himself off. Tall, broad, the kind of physical proportion that belonged to something that had been built over centuries rather than born. The uniform was Viltrumite white and gray, the design that GDA's threat library had flagged exactly twice in its operational history. His face was undamaged. The plaza around him was not. He looked at the crowd that had been scattering since the windows blew and said one word: "Kneel." Nobody did. So he threw the nearest car. Mark was 12 blocks away when the seismic hit registered through the soles of his feet. He was suited up in 4 seconds and airborne in 5. And by the time he cleared the roofline, he could already see the smoke rising from Keller Plaza and hear the secondary cascade of car alarms and human noise that meant the damage was real and spreading. His earpiece came on before he reached the plaza. 2 confirmed inbound. 1 has already made contact Keller and 4th. The second one is holding altitude above the East River observing. Do not engage the second one. Keep the first one's attention on you and away from the transit hub 3 blocks south. People are trapped in the plaza. I have a response team on the way. Your job is to pull him north toward the warehouse district. Less population density. Do you understand? Mark understood. He also saw from 200 feet up that there were people pinned under the car that had just been thrown, and that the Viltrumite on the ground was walking toward a cluster of civilians who had not run fast enough, and that the response team Cecil was describing would take 4 minutes to arrive. He came down fast and hit the Viltrumite from above with everything he had. The impact moved them both 20 meters west and took out a decorative wall and a news kiosk. Mark felt the contact through his whole skeleton, not a person exactly, more like hitting a structural pillar that had decided to hit back. He got one clean strike in before the Viltrumite turned, wrapped a hand around his forearm, and threw him into the facade of the building behind them. Mark came out of the masonry and shook his head clear. The Viltrumite was already moving toward the civilians again. I told you to pull him north. I'm working on it. He went back in. Back-tug. From the roof of a parking structure 4 blocks northeast, Izayoi watched the plaza through the haze of concrete dust and afternoon light. The Viltrumite hit Mark again, driving him down through a bus shelter and into the street below. Mark came up bleeding from a cut above his ear and immediately put himself between the Viltrumite and a group of people trying to get clear of a collapsed storefront awning. Izayoi read the pattern in approximately 8 seconds. Mark was not fighting to win. He was fighting to be in the way. First criterion, Viltrumite using civilians as bait. The one in the plaza was deliberately angling every strike toward populated areas, forcing Mark to choose between pursuing and shielding. Confirmed in the first 90 seconds. Second criterion, Cecil breaking the civilian protection line Izayoi had set. He had been running GDA's command frequency for 11 hours. Cecil was doing what Izayoi had expected, pulling Mark toward lower density zones, coordinating response teams, managing the perimeter. Efficient. Willing to let certain things burn in the process. But not yet using civilians as active leverage against Izayoi himself. Third criterion, Mark abandoning rescue to fight. Mark had just passed 2 clean opportunities to land a decisive strike because the trajectory would have sent the Viltrumite through an occupied building. He was losing ground. He kept making the same call. Izayoi filed all 3 and returned to watching. Below a section of scaffolding on a construction site half a block from the plaza began to buckle secondary structural damage from the impact crater's weight redistributing through the frame. 3 workers were on the upper platform with nowhere to go as the assembly started to lean. At the rate it was moving, the platform would come down in roughly 4 seconds, and the workers with it. A single brace on the upper section snapped. And instead of the platform dropping straight down, the whole structure torqued sideways, shedding its load against the building wall rather than onto the street. The workers ended up pressed against the exterior masonry. Shaken. Not falling. Izayoi lowered his hand and said nothing. He had not changed his position on the roof. The Viltrumite in the plaza had not noticed. Mark had not noticed. On Cecil's tactical channel, the scaffolding registered as a secondary incident status resolved, and the feed moved on. Cecil ran the operation from a mobile command unit 3 blocks out. His deputy was tracking 3 streams simultaneously: the plaza, the second Viltrumite's position above the river, and the news helicopters beginning to orbit the smoke column. Get those helicopters out of the airspace. Declare a no-fly. Use the chemical hazard angle until we have something cleaner. FAA is asking. Tell them we'll brief at Containment. That buys 40 minutes. He switched feeds. Where's the second one? Still holding at 8,000 feet. No movement. It's watching. Cecil studied the plaza readout. Mark was still in it, still choosing the punishing option, each time still getting worn down for it. The Viltrumite was not attempting to kill him. If that had been the objective, the first 30 seconds would have looked different. It was applying pressure, testing where the structure bent. Pull the transit hub evacuation. I want those platforms clear in 6 minutes. We'll need to halt 3 lines. Halt them. His deputy made the call. 3 subway lines went to emergency stop. The recorded signal issue announcement played on the platforms. Thousands of commuters became part of a managed evacuation they would later be told was a precautionary gas main response. Cecil watched Mark get driven through the corner of a building and come up slower than the last time. The Viltrumite above the river had started descending. Second contact inbound, dropping altitude. Entry point at the Keller district, approximately 90 seconds. Cecil ran the numbers. 2 Viltrumites, 1 compromised hero, a district taking structural damage faster than the response units could pace, and a variable somewhere in the northeast quadrant that had not moved and had not stepped in, and was for reasons Cecil had mostly given up modeling, still just watching. Get me the northeast quadrant feed. Half of them are dark, sir. Outages started about 11 minutes ago. Which ones are still live? Perimeter units. Everything inside the 4-block radius around the Wendell Street parking structure is offline. Cecil looked at the structure's position on his map. Then at the plaza feed where the second Viltrumite had just landed on a rooftop 2 blocks from Mark. "He's still watching." Nobody answered. It wasn't a question. The second Viltrumite dropped from the rooftop in a single unhurried motion. She was older than the first, her face carrying the weathered register of someone who had been at this long enough that it had stopped requiring expression. She looked at Mark braced against a vehicle, blood tracking down the side of his face, holding the first Viltrumite at distance with visible effort, and then at the street around him. Glass, rubble, civilians still extracting themselves from cover. She arrived at a conclusion the way you arrive at a number after running the same calculation you have run many times before. This one has something worth preserving. Not to Mark. About him the way you note a feature of terrain. The first Viltrumite released Mark's collar and stepped back. Mark used the fraction of a second to place himself between the two of them and a group of people emerging from a parking garage entrance. The Viltrumite had expected this. His expression said so. Your instinct makes you readable. Still not to Mark. Mark hit her anyway. It was a good strike. Full commitment, nothing held back. She moved 3 steps, turned her head, and regarded him the way you regard weather that has done something mildly noteworthy. What followed took 40 seconds and covered 2 city blocks. Mark landed hits that would have ended most things. He also absorbed punishment that accumulated in ways that showed by the end of it in his breathing. In the way his left arm tracked slower than the right, in the specific look of someone operating past a threshold they have crossed before and know the cost of. Through all of it, he kept making the same choice. Civilians first, fight second. Every time the option presented itself, the same answer. He came to rest against the back wall of a ground-floor retail space surrounded by display shelving and breathed. The 2 Viltrumites stood in the gap where the storefront had been and looked at him. "Kneel. We take the city intact." Mark spat blood. "No." She looked at her companion. "Send the signal." Janet, Cecil's signals unit intercepted the transmission burst 40 seconds later. Viltrumite coded channel. Short burst high compression. Authorization request for asset deployment. Response received. Asset confirmed in transit. A pause with a specific weight to it. Designation Conquest. The word reached every person in the mobile command unit. The deputy stopped mid-keystroke. The tracking officer did not look up from his screen because looking up would have meant someone could see his face. Cecil set down his stylus. Full containment posture, everything available. He paused 1 beat. And get Grayson a medical team on standby. He's going to need it before this is over. On the parking structure roof, Izayoi had caught enough of GDA's internal response to understand what the designation meant. Below, in the wreckage of the retail space, Mark was getting to his feet again. Slow, deliberate. With a particular quality of someone who had gone past the point where the body's own math would recommend stopping and was running on something else instead. The 2 Viltrumites watched him do it. The woman's expression had shifted by a fraction, not admiration, but the specific adjustment that comes from revising an estimate upward. She turned her head northeast. Not precisely toward the parking structure, she had no clean fix on him, but in the right general direction. Something old and experienced registering a presence it could not yet name. Isayoi looked back at her across the 4 blocks of smoke and debris and broken city between them. He thought about the scaffolding. He thought about the 3 criteria and what they had produced. He thought about what Conquest meant in terms of what this world's version of a war actually looked like at full volume. He took his headphones off and held them at his side. All right. To the smoke in the afternoon and the city that had no idea he was there. Now it's getting somewhere. Conquest came in from the east at low altitude fast enough that the sonic boom arrived 2 seconds after he did. He hit the corner of a 12-story office building on Renner and 9th, not because it was in his way, but because it was there, and because the sound it made when 4 floors of glass and steel came down was apparently the right way to announce yourself. The debris cloud rolled across 4 city blocks. Emergency dispatch received 47 calls in the first 90 seconds. The 2 Viltrumites from the previous engagement had withdrawn to the city's northern perimeter the moment the new signal registered on GDA's tracking net, which told Cecil everything he needed to know about the internal hierarchy of what he was dealing with. Conquest was not a soldier. He was a conclusion. Mark went in before Cecil finished the briefing. He had heard enough. The first 3 minutes were the worst kind of manageable, bad enough to demand everything. Not bad enough to make the math completely clear. Conquest moved through the financial district like he was testing acoustics. Varying his targets a bus, he redirected into a parking structure, not to kill anyone, but to block the evacuation route and hear the sound. A fire truck that had been positioning to assist with the building collapse, which he picked up and set back down 2 blocks away, with the deliberateness of someone rearranging furniture. He was not trying to maximize casualties. He was maximizing chaos, which was a more sophisticated objective and considerably harder to counter-program. Mark hit him from 3 angles in the first 90 seconds and landed maybe 30% of it. Conquest absorbed the rest with the specific quality of someone who has been hit harder by better and found the whole category of experience more interesting than threatening. He caught Mark's 3rd strike by the wrist and held him there for a moment, suspended mid-air in full view of whatever phone cameras had not yet been blocked by Cecil's jamming net. You protect them. The mild interest of someone reading a label. Not contempt exactly. More like noting a design flaw. Every time, even when it costs you the hit. Mark headbutted him and got loose. Conquest laughed. It was a real laugh, not performed, not cruel in the theatrical sense. Genuine amusement. The kind that comes from encountering something that confirms a long-held theory about the universe. Cecil was running 4 parallel tracks from the mobile unit. Track 1 evacuation corridors. The financial district had a grid of underground service tunnels originally built for utility maintenance, which GDA had quietly mapped and flagged as secondary egress routes after the last major incident 2 years prior. He had 2 teams threading civilians through them now, 1 block at a time, away from the active zone. Track 2 coverage suppression. Every live stream originating within 6 blocks was being flagged and interrupted through a combination of network interference and, in 3 cases, direct contact with platform compliance teams who had standing arrangements with the agency. The official story was a gas main rupture, combined with a structural failure cascade, plausible, consistent with the debris signature, and likely to hold for 4 to 6 hours before someone with better information started asking the right questions. Track 3 Conquest's movement pattern. He was tracking a rough spiral, widening, not random, testing the perimeter of his own interest. Cecil ran the projection and identified the endpoint of the spiral's current arm. A transit hub 2 blocks south, partially evacuated, still occupied by roughly 300 people who had not yet cleared the platform. Track 4 assets. Mark was the only one in the engagement zone with the physical profile to do anything useful. And Mark was getting taken apart in ways that were currently survivable but had a clear trajectory. Cecil had 2 other options, neither of them good, both of them operational. He authorized the first one, a building on the south side of Conquest's current position. Went up in a controlled detonation, not a large charge, just enough to redirect the spiral's momentum northward away from the transit hub. The blast took out the building's lower 2 floors and sent a pressure wave across the block that knocked 3 of Cecil's own evacuation team off their feet. They got up. They kept moving. That was what Cecil had calculated. From a rooftop 6 blocks northeast, Izayoi watched Conquest redirect after the detonation and noted two things simultaneously. Cecil had just blown up one of his own assets to adjust the battle geometry. And Conquest had smiled at the explosion, the way someone smiles when they realize the other player has finally started taking the game seriously. First criterion checked Cecil breaking the civilian protection line. The detonation had been calculated. The building had been evacuated. The blast radius had been managed. The evacuation teams had been positioned clear. Cecil had not used civilians as bait or leverage. He had sacrificed infrastructure. The line technically held. Second criterion check Conquest's treatment of non-combatants. The bus had been redirected, not weaponized. The fire truck had been moved, not used as a projectile into a crowd. Conquest was making the environment inhospitable without specifically hunting people. He was in his way, being efficient rather than indiscriminate. The line was bending, but not yet broken. Third criterion mark. Izayoi watched Mark pull a woman out of a collapsed storefront awning. She was conscious, one arm clearly broken, and Mark handed her off to an EMT before going back into range. Conquest had been waiting for him to come back. The hit that landed when Mark re-engaged drove him through 2 parked vehicles and into the wall of a parking structure hard enough to crack the foundation column. Mark came out of it bleeding from his nose and both ears. He stood up. That was the third criterion, not broken. Still making the same call. Still choosing correctly, which in Izayoi's assessment meant the test was not yet complete. He reached out and adjusted the trajectory of a piece of falling debris, a section of I-beam from the collapsed office building tumbling toward a group of 4 people pinned behind an overturned delivery vehicle. The beam torqued mid-fall, caught an overhang, and came to rest 6 feet from the group instead of on top of them. Nobody in the street saw it happen. Nobody on Cecil's tracking net registered it. The 4 people behind the vehicle scrambled clear and ran north toward the evacuation corridor. Izayoi lowered his hand. Below Conquest had picked Mark up again. He was holding him at arm's length, examining him the way you examine something that has continued to function past its expected operational limit. You're still trying to win. You can't. You've known that for 2 minutes. Why are you still here? Mark's response was to drive his knee into Conquest's chin with enough force to make the bigger man's head snap back. It bought him approximately 4 seconds of separation, which he used to put himself between Conquest and the transit hub's above-ground entrance, where a GDA team was still moving the last group of civilians down into the service tunnels. Conquest rubbed his jaw. The amusement had not gone away. It had deepened. There it is. That's the thing I'm going to break. The transit hub entrance cleared at the 8-minute mark. Cecil's tracking officer relayed it with the compressed relief of someone who had been watching a timer without certainty it would stop. Cecil did not acknowledge it. He was already on the next problem. Conquest had shifted his pattern. The spiral was compressing now rather than expanding, which meant he had found something he wanted to focus on. That something was Mark specifically, and the way Mark kept getting up. In Cecil's experience with Viltrumites, this was the phase where they stopped treating a fight as an assessment and started treating it as entertainment. Second asset, authorize. His deputy hesitated by 1 second, one more than usual, which Cecil noted and filed. The second detonation went off on the east side of the block. Another controlled charge, this one, designed to drop a section of elevated roadway across the intersection and create a physical barrier between Conquest's current position and the civilian evacuation route to the north. The roadway section came down with the sound of something enormous, deciding to stop pretending it could stay up. And for about 4 seconds, the entire engagement zone was obscured by a cloud of pulverized concrete. When it cleared, Mark was on one side of the barrier and Conquest was on the other. and Conquest looked at the rubble between them with the expression of someone who has just had a moderately interesting puzzle placed in front of them. He went through the barrier in 6 seconds. Cecil watched the feed. He had no third asset. He had jamming nets and evacuation corridors and a cover story that was currently holding, but would not survive the morning news cycle. And he had Mark Grayson, who was bleeding from 4 separate places, and had just taken a hit that had put him through a concrete barrier. And he had the knowledge that somewhere in the northeast quadrant, a variable had been watching all of this and had not moved. I know you're listening. To the open command frequency to the dead zone in the northeast camera net that had not shifted in 20 minutes. I don't have anything left that will slow this down. Flat. No affect. Not a request. A data point. Done. The data point landed exactly as intended. Izayoi had been counting, not seconds variables. He had 3 criteria and 12 minutes of observation and 2 small interventions that had preserved exactly the people he had calculated were worth preserving at this stage of the test. He had watched Mark choose correctly consistently at increasing personal cost. He had watched Cecil make 2 ugly decisions that were by his own system's logic correct. He had watched Conquest work through the engagement with the professional pleasure of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and found it worth doing. Third criterion still not fully broken, but approaching the edge. The edge was the point at which the data stopped being useful and the test became just suffering with no informational value. Izayoi had a precise sense of where that line was. He had been drawing it closer for 12 minutes. Mark took another hit. A clean 1 full force, no recovery leverage, and went down hard on the rubble-strewn street. He did not get up immediately. His hands found the ground. He pushed. He got 1 knee up. Conquest crouched in front of him, which was a theatrical gesture, but not an empty one. It put them at eye level, and it said clearly that what was happening here was not a fight anymore. It was a demonstration. And the thing being demonstrated was the distance between what Mark was and what was required to matter in the world. Conquest represented. Stay down. No cruelty in it, just the flat certainty of a measurement. You've done enough. Staying up just means you're choosing this. Mark looked at him. There was blood in his eye from a cut above his brow. His left arm was not working correctly. He was making a calculation or trying to through the specific fog of a body that has spent too long doing too much. He pushed off the ground. He made it to both feet. It was not a triumphant moment. It was a painful one, the kind that costs something real and permanent, the kind that Invincible would carry in his back and his rebuilt bones for months afterward. But he was standing. Conquest looked at him with something that was not admiration and was not contempt, and occupied a narrow space between them that was in its own way a form of respect. Interesting. He pulled his arm back. The blow did not land. Not because anything blocked it, because the air in the immediate vicinity of Conquest's extended arm stopped behaving the way air is supposed to behave for approximately 2/3 of a second, in a way that Conquest felt as something between resistance and wrongness. The sensation of reaching for a surface that is no longer there, of a law of physics briefly declining to apply. Conquest straightened. He looked at his arm. He looked at the space in front of him. He looked northeast with the specific alertness of something old and experienced, encountering a variable it does not recognize. Izayoi came down from the rooftop in a single drop, landed on the rubble 15 feet from Conquest without any dramatic impact, and stood up straight. Dark blue jacket, 1 button, white headphones at his neck. He looked at Conquest the way you look at a proof you have been working through for a while, and have finally reached the end of. Mark, still on his feet, looked at him. There was a specific quality to the look, not relief, not anger, not gratitude. Something raw. The look of someone who has been alone in something for a while and has just been joined and cannot yet determine whether that is better or worse. You were watching. Not an accusation. A fact delivered like one. I was. Izayoi did not look away from Conquest. You held longer than I expected. People died? Yes. A beat. No elaboration. No apology. Just the flat acknowledgement of a fact that both of them now carried in different ways. Conquest had been still through this exchange, which was itself interesting. He was not the kind to wait unless something had given him reason to reassess. He rolled his neck once the joints cracking in sequence and looked at Izayoi with a particular focus of something that has just identified a new priority. You're the variable. Not a question. The tone of someone completing a calculation. They started 11 blocks back. Izayoi looked at him. Took you long enough. I wanted to see what you'd let happen first. Conquest's expression had shifted into the register he reserved for things worth his full attention. Tells you a lot about a person, what they'll let happen. It does. Level carrying nothing that could be mistaken for nervousness or preparation. Just the register of a game reaching the part worth playing. Enough. Conquest smiled. It was genuinely a good smile. The smile of something that has been waiting for a long time, for a reason to stop holding back, and has just been handed one. He came forward. Conquest came in fast and low. The way he always came, in full commitment, no feint, the kind of approach that had worked on 1,000 things across 100 planets, because the math behind it was simple and reliable. Mass times velocity times the certainty that the thing in front of you cannot absorb what is coming. He covered the 15 feet between them in under a second. He did not cover the last 3, not because anything stopped him, because the last 3 feet had stopped being the kind of space that produced the outcome his body was calibrated to expect. The air, the ground, the relationship between his forward momentum and the target in front of him, all of it continued to exist and continued to function. It simply declined to participate in the conclusion he was driving toward. He felt it as a sensation without a name. The experience of arriving somewhere and finding the room had been rearranged while you were walking through the door. He pulled back, adjusted, came again from the left. Same result. The city block around them was already a ruin. The previous 14 minutes had seen to that. Half a building to the south collapsed inward. A crater in the intersection that had taken out the water main, so there was a gray fountain running across the rubble field. Broken glass from every direction, catching the afternoon light and throwing it in pieces. Mark was 15 feet to the east, pulling himself upright against a section of fallen facade, one arm hanging wrong. Conquest looked at Izayoi. Not with fear. Fear was not in his inventory. With the particular focused attention of something that has been handed a problem it has not previously encountered, and is in the process of deciding whether the problem is interesting or offensive. What did you do? He said, flat. Not a question. More like reading a result aloud. Izayoi did not answer. He was watching Conquest the way you watch something running a test. You already know the outcome of not impatient, not entertained exactly, but present in the specific way that comes from being the only person in a room who has read the last page. Conquest hit him. It was a real hit. Not a probe, not a measured strike, but the kind of blow that had punched through starship hulls and ended civilization's brief periods of resistance. It landed. Izayoi moved with it, the way water moves around a stone dropped into it. The force distributing outward into nothing particularly useful to Conquest, and when the motion resolved, Izayoi was standing 4 feet from where he had been, headphones still around his neck, looking at Conquest with the same undivided attention. The ground around the impact point had cracked in a radius. The facade Mark had been leaning against had shed another layer of itself. 3 blocks away, a car alarm started from sympathetic vibration and then stopped as if reconsidering. Conquest looked at his own fist. There it was, the fraction of a second Izayoi had been waiting for since this conversation started. Not fear. Something prior to fear. The animal recognition that the feedback loop had broken, that the thing your body tells you should be happening is not happening, that the rules you have spent centuries internalizing may not be the rules of this particular engagement. It lasted less than a breath. Then Conquest's expression closed back into something harder and more familiar. And he came in again faster, this time more committed with the specific intensity of someone who has decided that if the problem won't yield to force, it will yield to more force. He was not wrong as a general principle. As a general principle, it had always been right. More, Izayoi said, almost to himself, not a taunt in observation. Like a technician noting that a reading has reached the threshold they were looking for. Sad. Mark got his back against a piece of standing wall and watched. He had tried twice to re-enter the engagement. The first time, something had redirected him, not a physical force, more like the air pressure in the room, shifting in a way that moved him a step to the left instead of forward without anything touching him. The second time, a section of flooring had stabilized under his feet in a way that let him catch his balance instead of going down again. And by the time he processed that, he had been deliberately steadied. The engagement had moved 30 feet further east, and leaving was no longer a productive option. He understood watching Conquest continue to attack something that was no longer producing the outcomes Conquest was designed to produce, what Izayoi had meant by the word enough. Not a declaration of readiness, but a measurement. A line that had been drawn somewhere in the preceding 12 minutes and had now been crossed. Conquest drove a strike into Izayoi's midsection with enough force to have moved a building. The force went somewhere. Not into Izayoi, or not entirely, but outward in directions that didn't correspond to anything a normal impact would have generated. The rubble around them shifted. The gray fountain from the broken water main changed direction briefly. 2 pieces of shattered glass that had been falling completed their fall and landed. Izayoi stepped forward. Not a dramatic step. Not a step with announcement behind it. Just a shift of weight, the way you step toward a table to pick something up. But Conquest, for the first time since Izayoi had come down from the rooftop, took a step back. He did not do it consciously. Izayoi watched him realize he had done it. Watched the moment the recognition crossed his face like a fault line, the seam between what Conquest had always known about himself and what the last 40 seconds had been suggesting. "You're not fighting me," Conquest said. "Still working it out. Still refusing on principle to accept the conclusion. You're doing something else." "I'm ending it," Izayoi said. "There's a difference. You haven't landed a hit. I won't need to land one." Conquest looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then he did what Conquest always did when confronted with something that didn't resolve the way it should. He stopped thinking about it and hit harder. The sequence that followed was short. It was not a fight in the sense of an exchange between 2 comparable things. It was closer to the process of a lock being opened, not forced, not broken. Just moved through the correct sequence until the mechanism released. Conquest attacked. Izayoi moved. The attacks produced less than they should have, and then less than that. And then the asymptote hit its floor, and there was a moment where Conquest was committed to a motion that had no destination, extended through his own momentum into a position with no recovery. And Izayoi's hand came up once. Clean. Unhurried. The way you close a door. Conquest went down and did not get up. The rubble field settled. The gray fountain from the broken water main continued. Somewhere in the building wreckage to the south, something structural groaned and found a new equilibrium. The afternoon light was still the same afternoon light it had been 14 minutes ago, indifferent to what had happened under it. Ata. Mark pushed off the wall and walked across the debris field. His left arm was still hanging wrong. He stepped over a section of collapsed facade around the edge of the crater where the water main had gone and stopped a few feet from where Conquest was down. He looked at Conquest, then at Izayoi. Is he dead? No. You could have ended this earlier. Not anger exactly. The flat version of it, the tone that comes after the anger, has been compressed down through exhaustion into something harder and more permanent. Yes. People died in those extra 12 minutes. Yes. Mark stood there for a moment. There was blood drying on the side of his face, and his breathing was the careful kind that meant his ribs were registering objections. He was looking at Izayoi, the way you look at something that has done exactly what it said it would do in exactly the way it described, and you cannot find the lie in it, and that makes it worse rather than better. Then move them, he had said. I'm ending this. He had ended it. Mark looked at the city around them. What remained of 3 blocks of commercial and residential real estate. The fractured streets, the dust still hanging in the air. The distant sound of sirens that had been running in the background for 14 minutes and would be running for hours more. The ambulances. The structural engineers who would spend the next week figuring out which buildings were still safe to be inside. The families who would spend longer than that figuring out the same thing about the rest of it. Why tell me you were watching back at the clinic? Izayoi was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who doesn't have an answer. The silence of someone deciding whether the answer is worth the energy. Because you were the only one who would have done anything about it. I didn't. Not yet. Mark looked at him. Izayoi looked back the same level attention he had given every variable in this engagement since the beginning. And Mark understood in the particular way you understand things. You don't want to be true that the clinic and the scratched name and the 14 months and this moment were the same continuous thing to Izayoi, a single line of evidence about the world Mark lived in. And Izayoi had been watching to see what Mark would do with it. He didn't have an answer for that. He filed it with the others. Cecil received the feed confirmation at 4:47 p.m. He watched the playback twice, not the combat which his team would spend weeks trying to categorize, but the last 90 seconds. The moment Conquest went down. The way the physics of the engagement had read on every sensor his equipment had in range. Which was to say, the sensors had produced data that his engineering team would later describe in their official report as anomalous and non-reproducible. He watched Izayoi stand in the debris field, hands at his sides. Headphones around his neck, not looking at anything in particular. The way someone stands after finishing a task that required attention and no longer does. Cecil had run operations against Viltrumites twice. He had contingencies for Viltrumite's mechanisms and fail-safes and escalation protocols, each one representing years of planning and significant resources and the knowledge that any given one might not work. But the system as a whole gave Earth a fighting chance. He had nothing for this, not because it was too strong. He had dealt with things that were by conventional measurement very strong, because it operated on different terms entirely. His contingencies were predicated on the assumption that the thing he was dealing with played by the physics he knew. Take that assumption out and the entire architecture became decoration. Pull medical to the engagement zone, he said to the open channel. Full structural assessment before anyone enters the buildings on the south side. And get me a blackout on all imaging satellite aerial civilian. I want a window of at least 40 minutes before anyone outside this operation has pictures. a beat from the channel. "The Viltrumites on the northern perimeter," his deputy's voice came back. "They've gone dark. No signal, no position." Cecil already knew what that meant. They had watched the engagement on whatever surveillance Viltrumites used when they wanted to watch something without being seen. They had seen what happened to Conquest. They were not running. Viltrumites did not run. They were recalibrating in the way that something very old and very experienced recalibrates when it encounters a variable that breaks its existing model. The next move would not be Conquest. The next move would be something else, something that attacked differently from a different direction at a different target. He looked at the feed. Izayoi was still standing in the debris field. Mark was sitting on a piece of rubble nearby, head down, the careful breathing of someone managing pain. Neither of them was talking. Cecil thought about the Halverson documentation. He thought about the cells in the secondary facility and the 14 months and the 2 names still unaccounted for. He thought about what it would mean to attempt a negotiation with something that had already demonstrated twice now that the tools he used to negotiate were not tools that applied to it. He thought about what happened to planets that had things like this on them from the Viltrumite perspective. He picked up his direct line. "Get me Grayson's location," he said, "and clear me a channel that isn't on the standard rotation. I need to have a conversation that isn't going in any log." Sas. In the debris field, Izayoi looked north. The 2 Viltrumites were gone from the perimeter, which he had registered 12 seconds before Cecil's tracking system had. They were not retreating. He understood their logic. He had spent long enough in worlds where that kind of logic was the ambient operating principle to read it without thinking about it. They were going to find a different angle. They were going to use a different kind of force or the same kind of force aimed at something less able to absorb it. He thought about the clinic. The 30 people in the line. The man in the wheelchair. The single access road from the north. He looked at Mark sitting on the rubble, still running the math on what the last hour had cost. The problem with worlds like this, worlds that ran on the logic of the strong and the managed and the carefully hidden, was that the thing they were most unprepared for was not force. It was accountability. The Viltrumites would adapt their force. Cecil would adapt his management. Mark would adapt his understanding of what he was willing to do. None of that was the interesting part. The interesting part was what came after what happened to a system when the thing holding it together wasn't fear of the outside anymore, but the weight of what it had been doing to the inside all along. Izayoi put his headphones on. Not because there was anything to listen to, because it was time to think, and he thought better without the ambient noise of a broken city working out what it was going to be next. The bunker was 3 levels below GDA's secondary operations center. Not the facility Izayoi had walked through 4 nights ago, but a different one that Cecil had not used in 14 months and had never logged in any document that moved through the standard chain. The walls were poured concrete 8 inches thick with no network connection and no camera system. Cecil had chosen it specifically because it was the one room in his inventory that Izayoi had not already been inside. He did not flatter himself that this made it secure. He chose it because the absence of cameras meant the absence of a record, and the absence of a record meant that whatever happened here existed only in the memory of the people present. There were 3 of them. Cecil stood near the far wall with his hands clasped behind his back. The posture he used when he was doing the kind of thinking that required stillness. Mark sat on a folding chair near the entrance, his left arm in a field splint, a bandage above his right eye that someone had applied in a hurry and that needed to be redone properly. He was upright and present, and carrying the particular stillness of someone who has been through enough in the last 6 hours that the concept of comfort has temporarily stopped being relevant. Izayoi stood in the center of the room with his headphones around his neck. and looked at the walls the way he had looked at the containment cell 4 days ago, not trapped, just assessing the architecture of the situation. Cecil spoke first. The Viltrumite Empire has 17 confirmed staging points within 4 light years of this system. What happened today was a probe. When they recalibrate, and they will inside 72 hours, the next contact will be designed around what they learned. They learned that conventional force application doesn't resolve the variable. A pause, short and dense. That variable is you. Izayoi said nothing. I'm not asking you to work for me, Cecil continued. I've run that calculation. It doesn't produce a viable outcome. What I'm proposing is a directional alignment. You want to break things that need breaking. The Empire has things that need breaking. Those two facts can occupy the same space for long enough to matter. And in exchange? Non-interference. No surveillance, no tracking, no attempts at containment. Full passage through GDA-controlled space and airspace. And Cecil paused, the slight hesitation of someone putting something on the table they had spent time deciding whether to put their access to everything we have on the Empire's current positioning. Which is more than you'd find on your own, and faster. Izayoi turned from the wall and looked at him. Not with suspicion, the expression was something more precise than that. It was the look of someone who has been handed a document and is reading it for what it doesn't say, as much as for what it does. You're trying to aim me, Izayoi said. Point the problem at a different problem and let the two of them resolve each other. I'm trying to keep 8 billion people alive. Those aren't different things. Cecil's expression did not change. He had spent a long career having the logic of his operations named correctly by people who disagreed with him. And he had learned that the correct response was not to deny the logic, but to hold the position. No, they aren't. And after the Empire is handled? That's a question for after the Empire is handled. Which means you haven't closed the door on the option of coming after me once I'm not useful anymore. Izayoi said it without heat, the way you state a variable in a calculation. That's honest, at least. A beat of silence. In the background, faint through the concrete, the city's emergency frequency was still running. Ambulances, structural teams, the low-frequency hum of a municipal infrastructure working hard to process what the last 6 hours had done to it. Mark shifted in the chair, not moving, just adjusting the weight on his ribs. Cecil, the cells in the secondary facility, the 14 months, is that still running? The individuals have been relocated. That's not what I asked. The program is under internal review. Cecil's voice carried the precise neutrality of someone delivering a true statement that is carefully designed not to be the complete one. Pending outcome of current operational priorities. Mark looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Izayoi. Izayoi was watching Cecil with the same attention he had given Conquest in the last seconds before the engagement ended. Not hostile, not satisfied, just precise. Reading the position of a thing before deciding what to do with it. Here's what's going to happen, Izayoi said. The room went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. Not the quiet of people waiting, but of people recognizing that the decision point had arrived. The holding program ends, not under review ends. Every individual currently in GDA custody on the basis of enhanced classification without legal process gets a file, a status, and a choice about where they go next. The research connected to those programs, the medical documentation, the Halverson materials, whatever else is in the same category, gets destroyed or transferred to oversight. That isn't you. He paused. The two who are still unaccounted for from the facility I walked through, I want their status by morning. That's not a negotiation, Cecil said. That's a demand. Yes. If I dismantle those programs unilaterally, I lose the infrastructure I need to respond to the next threat. Not the Empire, the one after it. The one you won't be here for. That's your problem to solve without using people as parts. Cecil was quiet for 3 seconds. In the chair, Mark had stopped adjusting for his ribs and was sitting very still. And the Empire, Cecil said finally. I'll handle what I'm going to handle. That has nothing to do with whether you close the program. You're not giving me anything in exchange. I'm giving you the option to do it yourself before I do it for you. Izayoi's voice was level, carrying nothing that sounded like ultimatum and everything that was won. That's the exchange. You do it, you control how it looks. You don't, I do it, and you don't. Cecil looked at him, not calculating he had already done the calculation or as much of it as could be done in the time available. He was doing something else. The thing that came after calculation, where you had run the numbers, and the numbers said something you did not want them to say, and you had to decide whether you were going to accept the answer. I need 48 hours to do it, without creating secondary failures, Cecil said. If I pull those programs out of the infrastructure they're embedded in without staging it, I lose 3 other operational threads that have nothing to do with detention. People will die from those failures. 24 hours. That's not enough time. 24. No movement, no adjustment of tone, just the numbers sitting in the room. Another beat. Mark was looking at the floor. He was not going to intervene, they both knew it. Not because he didn't have a position, but because the position he had was one he hadn't finished building yet. And what was happening in this room was moving faster than his ability to locate himself in it. Cecil unclasped his hands and looked at the concrete floor. Outside, through 8 inches of poured concrete, the city's emergency frequency continued its low, unending work. There's a sub-file, he said. His voice had dropped slightly, not softer, but less projected, the voice of someone speaking a sentence they had not decided to speak until the moment they were speaking it. Connected to the Halverson documentation. It doesn't exist in any index I've shown you. It covers 6 individuals, not 14. Different classification, longer duration. The room was very quiet. I'm telling you this because if you find it on your own, you'll do something about it in a way I can't manage. If I tell you now I have 24 hours to handle it in a way that doesn't collapse the other threads. Izayoi looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was as close to surprised as he came, not at the information, but at the decision to offer it. That's the door you were going to leave open, Izayoi said. Yes. And you're closing it. I'm closing it in front of you, which means you know where it was. Cecil looked up. That's not the same as trust. I want to be clear about that. I know what it is. Izayoi held his gaze for a moment. 24 hours. The 2 unaccounted for by morning. The sub-file handled before you come back to me about the Empire. Cecil gave one short nod. The kind that doesn't indicate agreement so much as the acceptance of terms. One more thing, Izayoi said. Cecil waited. The lights in the bunker went out. All of them, the overhead fluorescents, the emergency strip along the floor, the indicator lights on the door panel, even the small red standby light on the ventilation unit in the ceiling. Total dark, the kind that exists 3 levels underground, with no windows for exactly 2 seconds. Then everything came back on. Cecil's hand had moved toward the door panel during the dark. It was back at his side now. His face was composed, but the hand had moved, and both of them had seen it. That's so you remember, Izayoi said that the 24 hours is a courtesy, not a limitation. Nobody answered that. There was nothing useful to say. Mark walked out of the bunker behind Izayoi through the operations center and up the 2 stairwells to the surface, where the night air smelled like smoke and pulverized concrete and the distant chemical tang of fire suppression foam. The city to the west was lit with emergency lighting. The regular grid was running at partial capacity in the financial district, and the rest was being managed by generator networks that were not designed to be permanent. He stopped at the top of the stairwell. "The clinic," he said. "The man in the wheelchair. You knew what this was going to cost before you let any of it happen." Izayoi stopped walking. "You knew people were going to die in those extra 12 minutes. You knew what Conquest was going to do to that neighborhood. And you let it happen because you needed the data." A long pause. Not defensive, not apologetic. Just present. "Yes," Izayoi said. Mark stood there for a moment with that answer. It did not get easier the longer he held it. "Is it worth it? What you're making Cecil do? Ask me in a year? That's not... The people in those cells didn't have a year." Izayoi looked at him. "Neither did the 2 who are still unaccounted for. The program has been running for longer than you've been invincible. I didn't create the situation. I created a deadline." Mark looked at the emergency lights to the west. "That doesn't make the 12 minutes not happen." "No." A beat. "Nothing makes that not happen. That's what it costs." He started walking again, heading north away from the operations center and the bunker and the city's western emergency grid. Mark watched him go until the darkness absorbed him, which did not take long. His earpiece clicked. Cecil's voice from 3 levels below. "He'll be back in contact before the 24 hours are up. He wants to watch me do it." A pause. "Go get your arm properly set. You're going to need it." Mark looked north for another moment. Then he went inside. And 40 minutes later, in the GDA operations center on the floor above the bunker, Cecil stood at his desk and looked at a document that had no index number and no routing history and contained 6 names, 2 dates, and a set of procedural notes that represented the worst thing he had authorized in 11 years of running the program. He had known when he authorized it that it was the worst thing. He had done it anyway because the alternative had been worse, and because that was the math he lived inside. He picked up a secure line and made 4 calls. The first 3 were to operational leads. The 4th was to a lawyer whose existence was not in any GDA personnel file, whose retainer had been paid from a budget line labeled miscellaneous consulting, and whose job, when called, was to make things that had happened to people officially unhappen in ways that gave those people the most options for what came next. He did not feel good about making the calls. He did not feel bad about it in a way that was useful either. He felt the specific weight of a decision that had been made and the specific different weight of a decision that was now being unmade. And the gap between the 2, which was where the people in that file had spent the last however long, and which no paperwork was going to close. He made the calls. Then he pulled up the Empire's last known positioning data and started building the brief he would need for the conversation that was coming in less than 24 hours. Because the program was not the only problem, and the problems did not wait for each other. Outside to the north, the Viltrumites, who had withdrawn from the perimeter, were doing what Cecil had predicted they would do, thinking, adjusting, looking for the angle that did not involve walking directly into the thing that had ended Conquest. They were patient. They had learned patience across millennia of doing exactly this to exactly this kind of planet, and they were very good at it. But Cecil had 24 hours, and Izayoi had made a promise. And somewhere in the operational math of the next 72 hours, there was a version of this that did not end with 8 billion people becoming a line in an Empire census. He was going to find it. That was what he did. The Viltrumite fleet did not announce itself. 11 contacts holding position at the outer edge of GDA's detection threshold arrived in the 47th hour after the bunker meeting. Not Cecil's 48-hour window, which Izayoi had trimmed to 24, but earlier, because the Empire did not operate on anyone else's schedule. The formation was precise, in a way that communicated intent without transmitting a word. We are here, we have assessed, and we are no longer asking questions. Cecil activated the frequency at 6:14 a.m. One tone, one sequence. The message was the activation itself. The line did not respond. He had not expected it to. The first Viltrumite came down over the waterfront at 6:31 a.m. Mark was there in under a minute, because that was what Mark did, because the math of whether to go had stopped being a calculation sometime in the previous 5 days and become something more like reflex. He came in from the east with the sunrise behind him and the bay below him, and his left arm still carrying the deep structural ache of something that had been through more than bone and cartilage were meant to process in a week. The Viltrumite on the waterfront looked up at him. "You're still standing." The tone of revised data, not admiration. "Our last assessment said you wouldn't be. Your last assessment missed some things." It did. He came up fast. What followed covered 300 meters of waterfront in 90 seconds and destroyed 2 vessels, a section of pier, and a cargo crane that had been scheduled for decommissioning in the spring. Mark landed hits that mattered and absorbed hits that cost him. Because the math of fighting a Viltrumite had not changed, you paid for every exchange, and he kept paying because stopping was not an option he had brought with him. His ribs were informing him with considerable emphasis about every movement by the time the second Viltrumite dropped from the sky to the south end of the waterfront. Then the third came down to the north. Mark looked at the geometry. 3 points, his position at the center. The math was not complicated. He heard from somewhere behind the collapsed crane a sound he had registered once, before the non-sound. Non-sound of physics, in a narrow area declining to function according to its usual terms. The Viltrumite to the south stopped moving mid-stride, not slowed. Stopped the way a frame of film stops when the mechanism decides not to advance. The one to the north turned toward the source, and its expression, in the instant before it too stopped, was the expression Conquest had worn in the fraction of a second before the end. The face of something running a calculation that was returning an error it had no category for. Izayoi came around the end of the collapsed crane. Dark jacket, one button, headphones at his neck. He looked at Mark the way you look at someone you left in the middle of something you knew they could handle, but wanted to confirm. 3 more in the upper atmosphere. 5 holding at the detection threshold. The other 3 already turned around. Already. They'll send the report back before the rest decide anything. That's how this works. He looked at the 2 stopped Viltrumites with the flat assessing focus of someone reviewing work they have nearly finished. The ones up high are here to watch, not fight. If they go back with a report that says the ground engagement failed, the Empire recalibrates and tries a different angle. Something slower. Something aimed at infrastructure rather than people. Mark looked at the sky. What do you need to do? What I need to do isn't the question. A beat. The question is whether you want to be standing in this city when the sky cracks. What does that mean? It means what I'm going to do is going to be visible. Izayoi looked up. From the ground. People will see it. Some of them will have cameras already running. Cecil's jamming net is operating at reduced capacity, and it cannot reach all of it in time. Mark looked at the emergency lighting still running in the financial district, 4 miles west the scaffolding on the towers that had come down the smoke that had stopped rising 2 days ago, but whose shadow was still in the smell of the air. The city. The people in it awake at this hour because the previous week had taught them that sleeping through alarms was a choice they could no longer make in good conscience. Do it, Mark said. What happened above Metro City at 6:44 a.m. was captured on 412 personal devices, 11 news cameras, 3 traffic monitoring systems, and a satellite imaging platform on a routine commercial pass. GDA's suppression infrastructure, running at reduced capacity since Cecil had begun pulling the threads attached to the dismantled programs, could not reach all of it in time. The footage showed different things depending on angle and device quality. Some showed light, not an explosion, not a directed beam, but a change in the way the sky above the bay organized itself, as if several square miles of atmosphere had briefly decided to behave differently. Some showed the Viltrumite contacts dropping off the tracking display, simultaneously not destroyed, but relocated to positions far beyond the detection threshold so abruptly that the system flagged it as instrument error before a human analyst confirmed it was not. Some captured nothing visual, but registered a sound below the normal hearing range that people would describe in the weeks afterward as the feeling of a very large door being closed by someone who had decided the room was done. The 3 Viltrumites on the waterfront were gone. Not dead. Removed to the outer system beyond the threshold alive and undamaged. And when GDA's retrieval team reached them, 6 hours later, deeply unwilling to discuss what had happened. The 8 contacts in the upper atmosphere and at the detection threshold were no longer in this planet's operational vicinity. The sky above Metro City looked like a sky. Mark found the family in the collapsed piers section 20 minutes later. The structural survey drone flagged a heat signature in a pocket under the decking, and Mark was the closest asset, and so he went. A woman, a man, 2 children. The younger one asleep against the man's chest, fine, the doctor would later confirm, which was the best version of that particular uncertainty. Mark got them out in 2 trips through a gap in the collapsed decking that he widened carefully and handed them to the EMT team running the waterfront perimeter. The woman pressed his hand once before the team moved her toward the triage area. He stood there after they were gone with the wreckage around him and the sound of a city entering the phase that came after sirens without acute emergency behind them. Generators at steady load, the voices of people doing hard work at a pace that could be sustained. His arm hurt. His ribs hurt. His understanding of the world he was protecting hurt in a way that did not correspond to any body part. He found Izayoi at the northern fencing where the pier met the street. The family in the decking. I shifted the load-bearing section before it finished coming down. They had 30 seconds otherwise. No apology, no expectation of acknowledgement. You were 400 meters out. Next time you'll be closer. That's not a compliment. No, it's a standard. A moment of quiet. The bay moved the way it always moved. Behind them, the triage area wound down its acute phase and began the longer work. You knew where they were before the drone, Mark said. Yes. You let me find them. You needed to find them. Just the fact undressed. You've been carrying 5 days of choices you didn't make and consequences you didn't cause. Finding them yourself is different from being handed them. Mark looked at the water for a moment. That's a very deliberate way of thinking about other people. Yes. Does it bother you? A real pause, not a gap before speaking, but an actual stop. No, Isayoi said, which is its own answer. Mark let that sit. You're leaving? I'm done here. The Empire's not gone. Cecil's operation has gaps that will take months to close. The city still... He stopped himself. Heard what he was building toward. You know all of this. Yes. And none of it's enough. I didn't come here to stay. Izayoi looked at him directly, the same level attention he had given every variable in this situation. From the beginning, I came because the game was worth watching and the board needed cleaning. I cleaned it." He paused. "You're going to rebuild something. Whether it's better depends on you, not on me." That's a convenient position. It's accurate. No deflection, no warmth, no edge. Just the flat register of someone who has arrived somewhere they are not going to be moved from. Cecil will reach for what he lost. Some of what he lost should come back. Some of it he'll justify with the next emergency, and the one after that. Watch that. Not because I'll be checking, because that's the version of this job that matters now. Mark looked at him. "You built all of it for after you were gone. The rule's the deadline, making Cecil close the door in front of a witness." Izayoi did not confirm or deny it. "The game was too dirty," Mark said. "The game was exactly as dirty as it always was. You just hadn't seen all of it." He reached up and adjusted his headphones. "Now you have. That's not nothing." He moved past the fencing onto the street. "Hey," Mark behind him. Izayoi turned. "Thank you for the family and the pier." The morning did its morning things around them. Gray light the bay, the smell of smoke and salt water, and the chemical residue of fire suppression foam. "Move them first next time," Izayoi said. "You were close enough." He walked north into the city, and the city took him in the way. It takes everyone who has finished what they came to do, without announcement, without ceremony, between one moment and the next. The oversight hearing ran for 12 days. Cecil testified on days 3, 7, and 11. He answered what he was required to answer. He declined the rest on grounds that held legally because the lawyer whose retainer came from the miscellaneous consulting line had spent 31 combined hours earning it. The sub-file 6 names, 2 dates, 11 years of procedural notes had reached a journalist named Carla Reyes through a source the internal review never conclusively identified, and her piece had run before the hearing convened, which meant the committee already knew the shape of what Cecil was going to tell them before he opened his mouth. He told them the shape. He managed the contents. 3 deputy directors resigned. An independent oversight mandate was issued for enhanced individual classification. Cecil retained his position, which surprised people who thought the hearing had been about accountability and did not surprise people who understood what the committee's alternatives looked like. He went back to work. The work was harder. The tools were gone, or compromised, or under review, and rebuilding what replaced them was slower and more visible and required more justification and produced, in some cases, worse short-term outcomes. There were gaps on every dashboard he ran open, places where capability had been questions, where answers had lived. He was also sleeping 4 hours a night instead of 3, which he had not predicted. Mark testified on day 9. He told the truth about the holding room, the cells, the scratched name near the floor, the folded blanket, the dried residue in the cup. He did not use Izayoi's name. He had thought about this for 5 weeks and decided that introducing a name nobody could verify or locate would turn the testimony into a different story, one that gave the committee something to chase, that would pull their focus from what needed focus. He did not feel entirely clean about that decision. He continued making it. 2 months after the hearing, late patrol over the financial district's rebuilt section scaffolding down on 2 of the tower's streets below, running near normal capacity. His comm activated. Cecil's voice. "New contact. Deep space. Different signature than Viltrumite. Different origin vector entirely." Mark leveled off. "How different?" "Different enough that I don't have a category for it." It lasted 8 seconds, then went silent. Below, the city ran its night routines. The memorial at Keller and 4th was still there, flowers rotated by the neighborhood, maintained by people Mark had never met, for reasons that were not all the same reason. He had flown over it so many times in 2 months that he had stopped consciously registering it, and had started instead just knowing it was there. "What do you want to do?" he said. "Watch it. Build a file. When we know what it is, we decide." Mark looked at the city below him. The new glass on the towers. The lights in the windows of buildings that were occupied again. The people inside them, who did not know what was moving at the edge of the detection threshold and would not know until someone decided they needed to. He thought about the clinic on the half-vacant block, the 30 people in the line, the man in the wheelchair and the single access road from the north. The difference between a system that was forced to stop and a system that decided to stop. "Yeah," Mark said. "Okay." He kept flying. The city below him was lit and damaged and rebuilding and alive, which was not the same as safe and not the same as fixed, but was what there was. It was enough to work with. It would have to be.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.